A Mexican research team was essentially paying poor women to get abortions. Let's look at what was going on here and why it's completely unacceptable. The goal of this research was not actually the abortion, that was just a consequence of what they did. So to find out what they did, let's just read the first article of this National Review paper. It says, women in Mexico were paid $1,400 to be hyperstimulated so their ovaries released bountiful eggs, instead of one during their cycle. They then underwent artificial insemination, resulting in early pregnancy with multiple embryos, which were then flushed out of their bodies for the study. So what's happening here is a process of hyperstimulation where they would produce plenty of eggs, you can see here. They would then be artificially inseminated in a lot of those eggs, and then every embryo that was created would then be removed. Or at least that was the idea. They would try to remove or flush out the embryos, but that didn't always happen. And the basic idea, as we can see here, is they were trying to show that this form of artificial insemination is just as healthy as basically any other, and that it's more effective because it can produce more embryos. Once the embryos were removed, some of them were frozen for later use. They were studied and made sure they were doing okay. Presumably, the ones who didn't pass some minimum bar of quality, I imagine, were discarded in some way, which we're talking about living embryos here. It's not just a thing, it's a living embryo. Already, we're getting into dicey territory here. Yes, the women agreed to this, but at the same time, you're using them as part of a guinea pig experiment and using their body, as we see a little bit later, as a petri dish. And that brings up ethical questions. But what makes it even worse is that some of the times, the embryos weren't all removed. And in that case, the women got abortions. As we see, NPR reported, in addition, some women underwent surgical or chemical abortions afterwards when tests indicated some of the embryos might not have been successfully removed. And I think that's a really important aspect here. Not only were embryos being created and then removed and frozen and possibly discarded, but the embryos that weren't properly removed were then aborted. So these women, the ones who didn't have all the embryos removed, were being paid to get abortions, essentially. This is a research team down in Mexico. Now, according to bioethicists, there are a number of problems here with this. First and foremost, you created life for the sole purpose of experimenting and studying it, and that is not ideal. Second, you basically paid women to have abortions, as we already talked about. Third, it treated the women as objects, merely as a petri dish. And fourth, as I already mentioned, hyperstimulation can be very serious and have very serious side effects. These are all reasons why this study was ethically questionable at least, but more likely it was ethically unacceptable. Nevertheless, they went through it and they did it in Mexico. Now, I do not think a study like this would be done in the United States. I think it would not be accepted, which is a good thing. But the fact that it's viewed as okay when it's done in Mexico by some, and they did it anyway, that kind of alarms me. Now, I want to go over real quick to the NPR article talking about this. The NPR title said, "Embryo research to reduce need for in vitro fertilization raises ethical questions," which is also accurate, but they don't bring up the abortion part quite yet. As a matter of fact, if you read through the NPR article, you have to scroll all the way down here till you get to the part about abortions, which I think is a pretty major part here. The fact that some of the embryos remained and had to be aborted is a big issue. If you're doing a research study when women have to get abortions, that's not a very good study. And this is a huge reason that I have problems with society as a whole today. Because of things like this, and because of something else that happened in New York, where they had an abortion is normal art exhibit in New York, and the proceeds went to Planned Parenthood. These exhibits are normalizing, as it says, abortion. And if abortion is normal, there is nothing wrong with abortion just being part of another scientific experiment and research study. Obviously, it's inherently wrong. But if you're trying to claim that abortion is normal, then by consequence, there would be nothing wrong with that. So the more and more people try and accept this norm of abortion, the worse and worse I feel it's going to get. And this is a shorter video. I just wanted to bring this to your attention and talk about how much I dislike this study and how ridiculous and unethical it should be, and yet it happened anyway. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.